Hello, my name's Jason. I'm 33 years old, a small business owner, and until a few weeks ago, I thought I was living the American dream. My wife, Rachel, and I have been married for 8 years, and we have a 5-year-old daughter named Emily. My life was my family and the business I poured my soul into, an outdoor equipment company I started with a lot of sweat and no shortage of sleepless nights. Rachel was my anchor, or so I thought. She was this stunning, driven woman who'd light up any room she entered. She worked in marketing and was incredible at it. When I launched my business, she was my biggest cheerleader, helping me network and polish my brand. Everyone who knew us said we were the power couple. At first, everything seemed perfect. We were that couple who posted adorable family pictures on social media, celebrating milestones with hashtags like hashtag teamwork and hashtag forever and always. Rachel loved the spotlight, and honestly, I loved watching her shine. I was proud to be her husband. But things started to shift a couple of months ago. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just little things that seemed off. Rachel began staying late at work more often, saying she was prepping for client pitches. She was on her phone constantly, smiling at messages, but when I'd ask what was funny, she'd just say, "Oh, it's just Karen from work being Karen." There were also the work trips. Rachel had never traveled much for work before, but suddenly, she was heading out of town every few weeks for investor meetings. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, Rachel was ambitious, she'd always been. But something about these trips didn't sit right. For one, she never mentioned the investors' names or where she was staying, which wasn't like her. Rachel loved sharing every detail of her day, right down to what she ordered for lunch. I chalked it up to stress, or maybe just her needing space. I've been putting in crazy hours, too, trying to land a deal with a big retailer that could take my business to the next level. We were both busy, distracted. That happens in marriage, right? But then, the tension started to seep into our relationship in ways I couldn't ignore. Rachel became snippy. Every small disagreement turned into a full-blown argument. If I asked her to help pick up groceries, she'd huff about how she wasn't my personal assistant. If I commented on how she seemed distant, she'd roll her eyes and say, "Not everything is about you, Jason." I was frustrated, sure, but more than anything, I was confused. This wasn't the Rachel I knew. She used to call me her rock. Now, I was starting to feel like a nuisance in my own home. And then there was Doug. Doug was one of the investors in my company, a sharp, charismatic guy in his late 40s. He was the type of guy who could sell ice to an Eskimo with a Rolex on his wrist and an ever-present smirk. Rachel met him at one of our business mixers and seemed genuinely impressed by his energy and ideas. She'd even said, "He reminds me of what I love about you, Jason. So driven." At first, I was flattered that she saw me in that light. Doug was helping my business, after all, investing heavily and bringing valuable connections. He became a regular at our dinner parties, always charming Rachel with his anecdotes and insider business tips. He was a part of our circle. Looking back now, I feel stupid, naive even. I trusted them both. And I had no idea my so-called perfect life was about to come crashing down. The first real jolt came during one of our family nights, which had become rare as both Rachel and I got busier. Emily had been begging to watch Frozen for the millionth time, and I finally managed to convince Rachel to take a break and join us. But Rachel sat on the couch glued to her phone, barely engaging with the movie or our daughter. At one point, Emily tried to show her a drawing she'd made, and Rachel barely glanced up. "That's nice, sweetie," she said absent-mindedly, her fingers still flying across the screen. Emily's face crumpled, and I felt a pang of frustration. "Rachel," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "can't the phone wait? Emily just wants your attention for a bit." Rachel sighed dramatically and set the phone down, but not before flipping its screen side down on the coffee table. That was odd. Rachel had never hidden her phone like that before. "Fine," she said, with that exaggerated tone people use when they're doing you a huge favor. "Let's all stare at the TV together." Emily didn't seem to notice the tension, but I sure did. I let it go for the night, though. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Rachel was just stressed. People get like that, right? But then it became a pattern. Her phone was glued to her hand at all times, during dinner, in the car, even when we were in bed. And it wasn't just the constant texting. Rachel started being weirdly protective of it, keeping it locked and tucked away like it was the crown jewels. One night, As we lay in bed, I decided to test something. She was scrolling through Instagram or something, and I jokingly reached over, saying, "Hey, what's so interesting? Let me see." Her reaction? She practically flung herself away from me, clutching the phone like it was a live grenade. "Jason, seriously? Can I have a little privacy? Not everything I do is your business." I blinked, startled. "I wasn't accusing you of anything, Rachel. It was just a joke." "Well, it wasn't funny," she snapped, rolling over and turning off the bedside lamp without another word. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. That was the first time I felt the knot in my stomach. It was like my instincts were yelling at me, but I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who second-guesses his wife or snoops through her stuff. That's not who I was. I trusted Rachel, or at least I wanted to. Doug, meanwhile, kept popping up in conversation. "Doug thinks we should expand our marketing to include outdoor adventure influencers," Rachel would say at dinner. Or, "Doug recommended this amazing podcast about scaling businesses." It was like he had become a fixture in her brain, as if his ideas and opinions mattered more than mine. I told myself it was just professional admiration. Doug was sharp, after all, and it wasn't like they were talking about personal things, just business, right? Still, something didn't sit right. She laughed harder at his jokes during our dinner parties than she ever laughed at mine. And once, I walked into the room to find her talking to him on the phone, her face flushed and her voice a little too upbeat. She didn't even notice I was there until I cleared my throat. "Oh, Jason," she said, startled. Doug and I were just brainstorming some ideas for the next investor pitch." "Late night brainstorming, huh?" I said, trying to keep my tone light, but failing. She gave me that look, the one that says don't start. "Doug's putting a lot of money into this company," she said coolly. "Maybe you should appreciate that instead of getting weird about it." Weird about it? I wanted to snap, but I didn't. Instead, I just nodded and left the room, feeling more like a stranger in my own house with every passing day. The breaking point came when Rachel told me she'd be gone for an entire weekend for an important investor retreat. I didn't even know these retreats were a thing, but apparently Doug was hosting it at some fancy cabin in the mountains. Rachel said she'd be working with him and some other investors to solidify plans for the next quarter. "I'll be back Sunday night," she said breezily, packing a duffel bag. "It's really important, Jason. You get how crucial these investors are, right? This isn't just for me. It's for us." I forced a smile. "Of course. It's great you're so involved." Inside, though, I was simmering. I wasn't sure what I was more upset about. The fact that she seemed to be prioritizing Doug's opinion over mine, or the fact that I had a sinking feeling this trip wasn't entirely business. The weekend Rachel left for the retreat, I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. I told myself I was being irrational, that Rachel was just dedicated to our business and wanted to impress Doug and the other investors. But the truth? I felt like I was standing on a frozen lake, and every creak underfoot warned me that the ice might break at any moment. On Saturday, Emily and I spent the day at the park. I tried my best to focus on her and not let my thoughts drift to Rachel. We built sandcastles, raced around the jungle gym, and shared a soft pretzel from the snack stand. Emily's laugh was pure, unburdened, and it was the only thing keeping me grounded. That evening, after putting Emily to bed, I found myself staring at my phone. Rachel had been texting updates throughout the day, but they were vague, things like busy but productive, or long day but making great progress. Something about it felt rehearsed, like she was ticking a box rather than actually trying to connect. I wanted to trust her, but my gut kept nagging at me. So I did something I'd never done before. I went through her laptop. She'd left it on the kitchen counter, and while I knew it was a massive invasion of privacy, my suspicions got the better of me. Her email inbox didn't reveal much, just some work-related threads and the usual newsletters. But when I checked her calendar, I froze. The investor retreat wasn't listed. In fact, there was no mention of any business-related trip at all. Instead, there was a single entry on Saturday. "Weekend plans TBD." I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. Who leaves their work calendar blank for a major investor retreat? Rachel was meticulous about keeping track of her schedule. She once logged a dentist appointment 3 months in advance. So, why was this trip different? I didn't know what I was looking for, but I couldn't stop. I opened her photo library, hoping for some proof that I was overreacting. Maybe she'd taken pictures of the retreat, shots of the cabin, or the group of investors she was supposedly with. But there was nothing, not a single photo from the trip. The next morning, I was still spiraling. I texted Rachel, trying to gauge her mood. Me morning. How's the retreat going? Rachel, busy but good. Can't wait to get home to you and Emily da. Me, who's all there? Rachel, just the usual investor crew. Mostly boring stuff, honestly. The usual investor crew? That didn't add up. Doug was the only investor I'd ever seen her interact with directly. And boring? Rachel loved these kinds of events, always coming back with stories about networking and brainstorming. The vagueness of her response felt like another crack in the ice. Later that afternoon, while Emily was napping, I got a call from Doug. It was unexpected, but not entirely unusual. He'd called me a few times in the past to discuss the business. Hey, Jason. Doug's voice was as smooth and confident as ever. Just wanted to check in about the proposal I sent over last week. Have you had a chance to review it? I hesitated, caught off guard. Not yet. Been swamped on my end. How's the retreat going? Doug paused. Retreat? I felt my throat tighten. Yeah. Rachel said you were hosting some investor thing this weekend? Doug chuckled. Oh no, man. I'm in New York for the week. Client meetings. No retreats here. The room spun. My grip on the phone tightened. Right? Must have misunderstood. I said, forcing a laugh. We wrapped up the call, but as soon as I hung up, I felt like I was going to be sick. By Sunday night, Rachel came home as though nothing was wrong. She kissed Emily goodnight, then plopped down on the couch next to me, her hair still damp from a shower. Tired but worth it, she said with a sigh. The retreat went great. I stared at her, trying to keep my face neutral. That's good. What did you guys work on? She smiled, but it felt forced. Oh, just some marketing strategies and long-term projections. Stuff you wouldn't find interesting. The audacity of her lie hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't call her out. Not yet. Instead, I played along, asking harmless questions while studying every word, every pause, every flicker of unease in her expression. Doug must have been a good host, I said casually. She froze for half a second, just long enough for me to notice. Yeah, he was great. Really knows how to run a productive retreat. I felt something inside me snap. I didn't know where Rachel had been that weekend, or who she'd been with, but I was determined to find out. By Monday morning, my head was a mess. I couldn't shake the way Rachel's face faltered when I mentioned Doug, or how she breezed through her made-up story about the retreat. Whatever was happening, she wasn't being honest with me, and I was done ignoring it. So I decided to dig, quietly, carefully, and without letting Rachel know I suspected anything. The first step was checking our shared bank account. Rachel and I had been pretty open about finances. She handled most of the household stuff while I managed the business-related expenses. But lately, I'd noticed her using her personal credit card more often, saying it was easier for work reimbursements. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but now, it felt suspicious. When I logged in, my heart sank. There were charges I didn't recognize, all from the past 2 weeks. A $250 spa service at a boutique Rachel had never mentioned. A $600 dinner at a high-end restaurant, while I'd been at home eating leftovers with Emily. And the kicker, a $900 charge from a luxury hotel in a nearby city, made just this past weekend. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Rachel hadn't been at a retreat. She'd been at a hotel, spending obscene amounts of money, while I was home playing the clueless husband. But it wasn't enough to confirm my suspicions. I needed more. I needed proof. That night, while Rachel was in the shower, I noticed her phone charging on the kitchen counter. It was locked, of course, but Rachel had always been bad about reusing passwords. I took a deep breath, punched in Emily's birthday, and held my breath. The screen lit up. I felt a wave of guilt, but not enough to stop me. I opened her messages, scrolling past the innocuous group chats and mundane work texts. Then I saw it, a thread with someone saved as T. The last message was from Saturday. Can't wait to see you tonight. Same room as last time? My stomach twisted. I scrolled up, skimming through weeks' worth of messages. Most were vague, but undeniably flirtatious. You're the only thing keeping me sane during these long days. I needed that more than you know. Same time next week. I love how you make me feel alive again. Who was T? My mind raced. At first, I thought it might be some old college friend I didn't know about, but the context didn't fit. Then it hit me, Tim. One of the investors Rachel had mentioned in passing, someone I'd met briefly at an event months ago. Tim was suave, well-dressed, and just Rachel's type. The next day, I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. It felt extreme, but I didn't trust myself to piece everything together without tipping Rachel off. I needed solid proof, something irrefutable. If I was going to confront her, I wanted the whole truth, not just breadcrumbs. The investigator, a guy named Marcus, was efficient and discreet. I gave him everything I had, Rachel's travel receipts, her messages with T, and the details of her supposed retreat. He promised to follow up within a week, but even that felt like an eternity. Meanwhile, I started watching Rachel more closely. The lies became glaring once I knew what to look for. She'd tell me she was running errands, but her GPS history showed her parked at the same swanky restaurant for hours. She claimed to be exhausted from work, yet she'd come home glowing, her hair freshly done. Each lie chipped away at whatever hope I had left for us. I wanted to confront her, to scream and demand answers, but I held back. Marcus had told me to be patient, and he was right. I needed to keep up the facade until I had all the pieces. By the time Friday rolled around, I was on edge. I'd barely slept, barely eaten, my mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. That evening, Marcus called. "I've got what you need," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Can you meet me tomorrow morning?" I agreed, my heart pounding. The next day, I drove to a small cafe where Marcus handed me a folder. Inside were photos, timestamps, and receipts, all detailing Rachel's weekend with Tim. There were pictures of them walking into the hotel together, laughing at the bar, and holding hands in the parking lot. The final nail in the coffin was a candid shot of Rachel kissing Tim goodbye before heading home on Sunday evening. I sat in my car after leaving the cafe, staring at the folder on the passenger seat. I felt numb, like the world had gone silent around me. I had the proof. Rachel had been cheating on me, with an investor in the business I built from the ground up. I didn't know whether to cry, scream, or throw up. All I knew was that I couldn't stay silent anymore. By the time I got home, the anger had settled into something sharper, cold, calculated. I wasn't going to lash out. No yelling, no teatrix. Rachel had lied to me, betrayed me, and I was going to make her face it head-on. That evening, she came home from work like nothing was wrong, carrying a reusable shopping bag and wearing that same bright, fake smile. "Hey, babe," she said, leaning in for a quick kiss. "How was your day?" I stared at her, my face unreadable. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered. "What's wrong?" "Sit down," I said, motioning to the couch. She hesitated but obeyed, setting her bag on the floor. I grabbed the folder Marcus had given me from my desk and placed it on the coffee table between us. "What's that?" she asked, her voice tight. "Open it," I said, leaning back in my chair, arms crossed. She didn't move at first, her eyes flicking from me to the folder and back again. Slowly, she reached forward and opened it. The first photo, the one of her and Tim walking into the hotel, was on top. Her face went pale. What is this?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "You tell me," I said evenly. She flipped through the photos, her hands shaking. When she got to the one of her kissing Tim, she closed the folder and sat back, tears already forming in her eyes. "Jason, it's not what it looks like," she started. I let out a bitter laugh. "Not what it looks like? Are you seriously going to try that line?" "Rachel, I'm not an idiot. I have receipts, timestamps, and pictures. You lied about the retreat. You lied about everything." Her tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to happen." "You didn't mean for it to happen?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "What does that even mean, Rachel? You accidentally checked into a hotel with him? Accidentally spent the weekend together?" She looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy. "It wasn't like that, Jason. Tim and I, we just connected. I've been so lonely, and you're always so busy with work. I didn't know how to tell you how unhappy I was." "Lonely?" I shot back, my voice cold. "You're blaming me for this? For you sneaking around, lying to my face, and betraying me with someone who's supposed to be an investor in my business. I'm not blaming you, she said, her voice cracking. I'm just trying to explain how I felt. It was a mistake, Jason, I swear. It didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything? I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You're not sorry it happened. You're sorry you got caught. She didn't deny it. Instead, she sat there crying, her shoulders shaking as I stared at her, feeling a mix of rage and heartbreak. How long? I asked finally, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. What? How long has this been going on? She hesitated, then looked away. A few months, she admitted. Months. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. She'd been lying to me, to our family for months. Did you think about Emily? I asked, my voice low. Did you think about what this would do to her? To us? Of course I did, she said, her voice rising. I love her, Jason. I love you. I made a mistake. Please, we can fix this. We can go to counseling, work on us. Work on us. I cut her off. You think we can come back from this? That I can just forget everything you've done? She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. Don't. I need time to think. And honestly, right now, I don't even want to look at you. Rachel sobbed harder, but I didn't move to comfort her. I stood, grabbed my keys, and walked out the door, leaving her alone in the house where we'd built our life together. The drive was a blur. I ended up at a small diner on the edge of town, nursing a cup of coffee I didn't even want. My mind was racing, replaying every lie, every moment of betrayal. I thought about Emily, about how this would affect her. Part of me wanted to forgive Rachel, to pretend this was something we could move past. But the other part of me, the part that couldn't stop picturing her with Tim, knew things would never be the same. By the time I went home, the house was dark. Rachel was in the guest room. I stood outside the door for a moment, listening to her muffled sobs, but I couldn't bring myself to go in. Instead, I went to bed, alone, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. The morning after the confrontation felt surreal. Rachel was quiet, moving around the house like a ghost. The air between us was thick with everything left unsaid. Emily's chatter during breakfast was the only thing keeping the tension from boiling over. I sat across from Rachel at the table, catching her stealing glances at me when she thought I wasn't looking. Once Emily was at school, Rachel finally broke the silence. Jason, she began, her voice trembling. I know I hurt you. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. For us. For Emily. I stared at her, trying to figure out if the tears in her eyes were real or just part of the act. You don't get it, Rachel, I said, my voice cold. This isn't about fixing anything. You didn't just hurt me. You betrayed me. You betrayed our family. She wiped at her tears, her hands shaking. I know, and I'll do anything to make it right. Will you? I shot back, standing up and pacing the room. Would you have told me if I hadn't found out? Would you have stopped seeing him if I hadn't caught you? She didn't answer, and her silence was all I needed to know. Over the next few days, we fell into an uneasy routine. We barely spoke, only interacting when it came to Emily. I slept in the guest room, unable to even think about sharing a bed with Rachel. She tiptoed around me, trying to give me space, but every time I looked at her, all I could see was her with Tim. At work, it was worse. Doug, blissfully unaware of the storm raging in my personal life, kept texting me about strategy meetings and new investor opportunities. Every time his name popped up on my phone, I felt a flash of anger. Doug had brought Tim into our orbit. He'd vouched for him, introduced him to Rachel. And now, I couldn't separate my business from the mess of my marriage. The breaking point came one evening, when Rachel sat me down after Emily had gone to bed. I've ended it, she said, her voice firm. I called Tim and told him it's over. I blocked his number. I'm cutting all ties. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. You think that's enough? I asked, my voice low. I don't know, she admitted, her voice cracking. But it's a start. I want to fight for us, Jason. I'll do anything. Her words sounded sincere, but I couldn't trust them. Not after everything. You say that now, I said, shaking my head. But how do I know this isn't just damage control? How do I know you're not just scared of losing everything? She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Because I love you, she said, tears spilling down her face. I love you, and I hate what I've done. I'm begging you to give me a chance to prove that. Her tears didn't move me this time. I was too far gone, too angry, too hurt. Love doesn't look like this, Rachel, I said quietly. Love doesn't lie. It doesn't cheat. It doesn't destroy everything it touches. That night, I called Marcus, the private investigator, to ask if he'd found anything else. He hadn't, but he did confirm that Rachel hadn't contacted Tim since she'd ended things. It was a small comfort, but it wasn't enough to change how I felt. I spent the rest of the week avoiding Rachel as much as possible, throwing myself into work and spending extra time with Emily. I needed to figure out my next steps, to decide if I could even stay in this marriage. Then came the bombshell I wasn't prepared for. On Friday evening, as I was putting Emily to bed, Rachel appeared in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with red. "Jason, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. "Not now," I said, brushing past her to head to the kitchen. "It's about the business," she called after me. That stopped me in my tracks. "What about the business?" I asked, turning to face her. She hesitated, wringing her hands. "Tim, he wasn't just using me, Jason. He's been siphoning funds from the company. I just found out this morning." The words hit me like a freight train. "What are you talking about?" "Doug mentioned something about a discrepancy in the accounts during a call today," she explained, her voice shaking. "I checked the numbers and, Jason, Tim's been funneling money out of the company. Thousands of dollars. He was using our accounts to fund his personal projects." My chest tightened. "And you're just now telling me this?" "I didn't know," she cried. "I swear I didn't know. He must have used my access to cover his tracks. I had no idea." I stared at her, my mind racing. I wanted to believe her. I really did, but trust was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. "Give me everything," I said, my voice cold. "Emails, files, bank statements. I want to see it all." I stayed up that night, going through the documents Rachel gave me. Bank statements, email threads, internal financial reports. All of it painted a damning picture. Tim had been funneling money out of the company for months, masking it under fake expenses and dummy vendor accounts. The losses were staggering, well over $75,000. Worse, Rachel's name appeared on several of the transactions. She wasn't directly authorizing the transfers, but her account had been used to process the paperwork. Whether she knew it or not, she had been a pawn in Tim's scheme. By the time I finished piecing everything together, I felt like I was drowning. The man I'd trusted as an investor had not only stolen from me, but had used my wife to do it. And Rachel, whether complicit or just oblivious, had let him in. The next morning, I called Doug. "Jason, good to hear from you," he said, his usual chipper tone grating against my nerves. "Doug, we have a problem," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "It's about Tim." There was a pause on the line. "What about Tim?" I laid it all out. The missing funds, the fake accounts, and the evidence tying Tim to the embezzlement. Doug listened in stunned silence. "I can't believe this," he said finally. "I vouched for that guy. I brought him into this deal." "Yeah, well, he used you just like he used me," I said. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Doug assured me he'd back me up in whatever action I wanted to take. He sounded genuine, but at this point, I trusted no one. Back at home, Rachel was a wreck. She paced the kitchen as I updated her on my conversation with Doug. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I'm calling the cops," I said without hesitation. Rachel froze. "The cops? Jason, are you sure? What if it what?" I snapped, cutting her off. "Blows up? Rachel, it already has. Tim didn't just steal from me. He stole from the business, from our family. This isn't negotiable." She looked like she wanted to argue, but thought better of it. By Monday, I'd filed a formal complaint against him with the police. Doug and I worked together to freeze the remaining accounts and begin recovering as much of the stolen money as we could. The process was slow and infuriating, but at least I felt like I was taking control again. Rachel, on the other hand, seemed paralyzed by guilt. She tried to help where she could, making calls, organizing documents, but I could feel the weight of her shame in every interaction. "Jason," she said one night, breaking the silence that had become our norm. "I didn't know about the money. I swear to you I didn't. But I should have seen it. I should have asked more questions. You should have told me the truth." I said coldly. About everything. If you'd come to me sooner, we might have stopped this before it got out of hand. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. You're right. I am sorry. I'm so sorry. Her apologies felt hollow. I wanted to believe her, but the damage was already done. The fallout from Tim's betrayal spread quickly. When news of the embezzlement reached the other investors, it was like setting off a bomb. Some threatened to pull their funding, while others demanded answers. Doug and I spent hours in meetings trying to stabilize the situation. Tim, of course, denied everything. When confronted, he claimed it was all a misunderstanding, a mix-up in the accounting. But the evidence was airtight, and once the police got involved, his lies started to unravel. Through it all, Rachel tried to be supportive, but I couldn't bring myself to let her in. Every time I looked at her, I saw her with Tim, laughing, kissing, conspiring. Even if she hadn't known about the money, she'd still betrayed me in the most personal way possible. One evening, she sat down across from me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Jason, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I know I've lost your trust, and I don't know if I'll ever earn it back. But I need you to know that I want to fix this. Not just for us, but for Emily. She deserves better than this. I stared at her, my chest tightening. Part of me wanted to believe her, to give her a chance. But another part, the part still raw from the betrayal, wasn't sure I ever could. I need time, I said finally. Time to figure out if there's anything left to fix. Her face crumpled, but she nodded. I'll give you all the time you need, she said. Days turned into weeks, and the chaos around Tim's betrayal didn't let up. The police investigation uncovered even more stolen funds, and his arrest was all but guaranteed. Doug and I worked tirelessly to salvage what we could of the business, though every step felt like climbing out of quicksand. Investors were skittish, employees were whispering, and my reputation, the one I'd worked so hard to build, felt tarnished. At home, the distance between Rachel and me grew unbearable. She tried to make amends, cooking dinner every night, offering to help with work, and being overly attentive to Emily. But no matter what she did, I couldn't shake the image of her and Tim. Her betrayal was a splinter lodged too deep to ignore, and every attempt she made to fix things only seemed to drive it further in. One night, after Emily was asleep, Rachel cornered me in the living room. She stood there, arms crossed, her face etched with frustration and desperation. Jason, we can't keep living like this, she said. Living like what? I replied, not bothering to look up from the financial report I was reviewing. Like strangers, she said, her voice breaking. You won't talk to me. You won't even look at me unless you have to. I know I screwed up, but how are we supposed to fix this if you won't even try? I closed the laptop and finally looked at her. You want to fix this? Tell me, Rachel. How do you fix what you broke? How do you fix lying to my face? Cheating? Letting that man not only into our lives, but into my business, my livelihood? Tell me, how do you come back from that? She flinched, tears brimming in her eyes. I don't know, she whispered. But I love you, Jason. I love Emily. I want to fight for us. I let out a bitter laugh. Love? Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like love meant nothing to you when you were sneaking off to hotel rooms with Tim. Her tears spilled over, and she dropped onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I don't know what to say, she sobbed. I don't know how to make this right. I wanted to feel something, anger, pity, anything, but all I felt was exhaustion. Maybe you can't, I said flatly, standing up. Maybe some things can't be fixed. The next day, I finally heard back from the police. Tim had been arrested on charges of fraud and embezzlement. The officer I spoke with assured me that the evidence was overwhelming and that the case would likely go to trial. It should have felt like a victory, but instead, it felt hollow. I called Doug to share the news. He was relieved but also wary. This will help, he said, but some of the investors are still on edge. We've got a long road ahead, Jason. I thanked him and hung up, staring at the phone in my hand. My business was in shambles, my marriage was in ruins, and I felt like a shell of the man I used to be. That evening, Rachel approached me again. She looked nervous, clutching a small notebook in her hands. What now? I asked, my patience worn thin. I've been journaling, she said softly. writing down everything I've been feeling. I thought, I thought maybe it could help if you read some of it, so you could understand. I wanted to tell her no, to push her away again, but something about the vulnerability in her voice stopped me. I took the notebook and flipped through a few pages. Her words were raw and messy, full of guilt, regret, and confusion. I feel like I'm drowning in my own mistakes. I hate myself for what I did to Jason, to Emily, to our family. I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't know if I'll ever earn his trust back, but I'll die trying. I closed the notebook and handed it back to her. This doesn't change anything, I said. I still don't know if I can ever forgive you. She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. I understand, but I'm not giving up on us. Not yet. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. Rachel's words replayed in my mind, mixing with memories of our life before everything fell apart. Part of me wanted to believe her, to hold on to the hope that we could rebuild. But another part of me wondered if clinging to the past was only prolonging the inevitable. For the first time, I thought about what life might look like without her. Without the weight of betrayal hanging over every interaction. Without the constant reminders of what I'd lost. The thought scared me, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. The next morning, the house was unusually quiet. Rachel had already left for work, and Emily was still asleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the folder of evidence against him. It was strange. This whole ordeal had started with his betrayal, but now it felt like the real fracture was between Rachel and me. I couldn't avoid the truth anymore. The life we built wasn't just cracked, it was shattered. And I wasn't sure if it could, or should, be pieced back together. Later that day, Doug called again. We got some progress, he said. A few of the investors are starting to come around now that Tim's been arrested. They see you're cleaning up the mess and handling things. That's good, I said, though my voice lacked enthusiasm. Doug hesitated. Jason, are you okay? I mean, aside from all this business stuff? I rubbed my temples, debating how much to say. Doug wasn't just a colleague. He was someone I considered a friend. But after everything with Tim and Rachel, my trust in people was at an all-time low. I'm managing, I said finally. That's all I can do right now. Well, if you need anything at all, you know where to find me, Doug said. That evening, I made a decision. After dinner, I sat Rachel down at the same table where I'd confronted her with Marcus's evidence. She looked nervous, clutching her hands in her lap. I've been thinking, I began. Her eyes widened slightly, but she stayed quiet, waiting for me to continue. I can't live like this anymore, I said. The lying, the distrust, the constant weight of everything that's happened. It's killing me, Rachel. Tears immediately welled up in her eyes. Jason, please. I know I've hurt you. I know I've broken your trust. But I love you. I love our family. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, anything to make this right. I know you are, I said softly. But I don't know if I am. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. And even if I could, I don't know if I'd want to. Her tears spilled over, but she didn't argue. So, what are you saying? She asked, her voice trembling. I think we need time apart, I said, the words feeling heavy but necessary. I'm not saying this is the end, but I need space to figure out who I am outside of all this pain. Rachel covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. What about Emily? She asked between gasps. How do we explain this to her? We tell her the truth, that we both love her and that this isn't her fault, I said. And we make sure she knows we'll always be there for her, no matter what. Rachel nodded, though her tears didn't stop. Over the next few days, I started making arrangements. I found a small rental apartment across town. Not much, but it was enough for me to clear my head and figure out my next steps. Moving out felt surreal, like I was walking away from a life I'd spent years building. But as painful as it was, it also felt like I could finally breathe again. Explaining the separation to Emily was the hardest part. She didn't understand why Daddy wasn't going to be living at home anymore. Rachel and I sat her down together, assuring her that we both loved her and that this wasn't her fault. She cried, clinging to me, and it took everything in me not to fall apart in front of her. In my new apartment, I began to focus on myself for the first time in years. I went to therapy, poured myself into rebuilding the business, and spent as much time with Emily as possible. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness felt unbearable, and I found myself staring at old photos of Rachel and me, wondering where it had all gone wrong. But slowly, I started to feel like I was reclaiming my life. Rachel called often, sometimes to talk about Emily, sometimes just to check in. I could tell she was trying, that she still held on to the hope that we might reconcile. But for now, I kept my distance. I needed to heal, to figure out if forgiveness was even possible. The idea of moving on scared me, starting over, building a new life, but it also felt like a chance to find peace. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to think about what I wanted, not just what I'd lost. The days after moving out were a strange mix of freedom and emptiness. My new apartment wasn't much, a modest two-bedroom with a cracked bathroom tile and a view of the parking lot, but it was mine. I spent the first few days unpacking boxes and arranging furniture, trying to make it feel like home. Still, there was no escaping the hollow ache of what I'd left behind. The nights were the hardest. Without Emily's giggles echoing down the hall or Rachel bustling in the kitchen, the silence felt suffocating. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the last few months in my mind. It was like a film I couldn't stop watching. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment of doubt. But as the days turned into weeks, something surprising happened. I started to feel lighter. I threw myself into work, tackling the fallout from Tim's embezzlement with a renewed sense of purpose. Doug and I tightened up the company's operations, installing stricter financial controls and rebuilding relationships with wary investors. It wasn't easy. Some of the damage Tim caused couldn't be undone, but the business was stabilizing, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was back in control. Therapy helped too. My therapist, Dr. Ellis, was a no-nonsense woman who didn't let me wallow. "You're grieving," she said during one session, her voice steady. "Not just your marriage, but the life you thought you had. That's normal. But grief doesn't define you. What you do with it, that's what matters." Her words stuck with me. Co-parenting with Rachel was awkward, but manageable. We'd agreed to split custody of Emily 50-50, and we stuck to the schedule like clockwork. Drop-offs were civil but distant, polite smiles, short exchanges, nothing more. I could see the sadness in Rachel's eyes every time she handed Emily over, but I kept my own emotions in check. Emily, on the other hand, seemed to be adjusting better than I'd expected. Kids are resilient, I guess. She'd chatter endlessly about school, her new favorite TV show, or the latest masterpiece she created in our class. Being with her was like a balm for my soul, a reminder that no matter how much I'd lost, I still had something worth fighting for. Rachel called one evening after Emily was asleep. "Jason," she began, her voice hesitant. "How are you doing?" I hesitated, unsure how much to share. "I'm managing," I said finally. "I miss you," she said softly. "I miss us." I closed my eyes, the weight of her words settling on my chest. "Rachel, I'm still trying to figure out if there's an us to miss." She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was thick with emotion. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I love you, Jason. I love our family, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. Counseling, therapy, anything." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that love could be enough to bridge the chasm between us. But I wasn't sure it could. A few days later, Rachel sent me an email, longer than anything she'd ever written before. She laid everything out. Her guilt, her regret, her reasons or excuses, depending on how you looked at it. She wrote about how she'd felt unseen, unappreciated, and disconnected from me long before Tim came into the picture. Reading her words was like a punch to the gut. She wasn't wrong. I had been distant, more focused on the business than our marriage, more attuned to the bottom line than her emotional needs. That didn't excuse what she did, but it forced me to confront my own role in the breakdown of our relationship. One Saturday, while Emily was at a friend's birthday party, I met Rachel for coffee. It was the first time we'd sat down alone since the separation. She looked different, tired but also determined. "Thank you for coming," she said, fiddling with her coffee cup. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "What do you want to talk about?" She took a deep breath. "I know I've said this before, But I need you to hear me. I'm sorry, Jason. For everything. For lying. For betraying you. For letting Tim into our lives. I hate what I've done, and I'll hate it for the rest of my life. Her voice cracked, and she looked away, blinking back tears. I don't expect you to forgive me. I need you to know that I'm trying. I'm in therapy. I'm working on myself. And whether or not we ever get back together, I want to be a better person. For you, for Emily, and for myself. Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. For the first time in months, I saw a flicker of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Not perfect, but genuine. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I appreciate you saying that. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. That's all I can ask. Rachel's words stayed with me after our coffee meeting. For days, they echoed in my mind as I went about my routine. I'm trying. Whether or not we get back together, I want to be better. It was hard to know if I could trust her sincerity. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like she wasn't just scrambling to save face. She genuinely seemed to be taking responsibility. Still, responsibility wasn't the same as repair. At therapy, Dr. Ellis pushed me to confront my feelings head-on. You're stuck, Jason, she said during one session. You're holding on to your anger because it feels safer than vulnerability. But if you want to move forward, whether that's with Rachel or without her, you need to figure out what healing looks like for you. Her words made sense, but they didn't make the process any easier. How did I heal from a betrayal that had cut so deeply? How did I let go of the resentment without excusing what Rachel had done? Emily's happiness became my anchor during those weeks. We spent as much time together as possible, baking cookies, going to the park, and reading her favorite stories before bed. She was too young to fully understand what was happening, but I could tell she felt the shift in our family. One night, as I tucked her in, she looked up at me with those big, curious eyes. Daddy, she said softly, do you still love Mommy? The question hit me like a freight train. I froze, unsure how to answer. I love Mommy as your mommy, I said finally. And I love you more than anything in the world. That will never change. She seemed satisfied with that, snuggling into her blanket. But the question lingered in my mind long after she'd fallen asleep. A few weeks later, Rachel suggested we try family therapy. It doesn't mean we're getting back together, she said quickly, as if reading my mind. I just think it might help. If not for us, then for Emily. It was hard to argue with that logic. For all my bitterness toward Rachel, I couldn't deny that Emily deserved parents who could at least communicate civilly. Reluctantly, I agreed. Our first session was tense. Rachel and I sat on opposite ends of the couch, both avoiding eye contact as the therapist, a kind but firm woman named Dr. Mendez, guided us through the basics. I'm not here to fix your marriage, she said bluntly. That's up to you. My job is to help you learn how to work together as co-parents. And if you want to address the other stuff, we can go from there. Rachel opened up quickly, talking about her guilt, her shame, and her desire to rebuild trust. I listened in silence, torn between skepticism and a small, hesitant flicker of hope. When it was my turn, I didn't hold back. I talked about the betrayal, the lies, and the damage they'd done, not just to our marriage, but to my sense of self. You made me feel like a fool, I said, my voice tight. You made me question everything I thought I knew about us, about you. Rachel didn't interrupt or defend herself. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, she said quietly, and I hate myself for it. The sessions continued over the next few months. They weren't easy. There were moments when the tension between us boiled over, when old wounds were ripped open again. But slowly, we started to communicate better. Dr. Mendez encouraged us to focus on small victories. A civil conversation about Emily's school projects, a shared laugh over one of her silly stories. Each moment felt fragile, like a thread barely holding us together, but it was something. Outside of therapy, I was still finding my footing. I spent more time with friends I'd neglected over the years, went for long runs to clear my head, and even joined a local hiking group. Being around new people reminded me that life existed beyond the walls of my marriage, that I was still Jason, not just Rachel's husband or Emily's dad, but my own person. One evening, Rachel asked if I'd stay for dinner after dropping off Emily. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. We ate at the same dining table where we'd once shared countless meals as a family. It was awkward at first, but as Emily chattered about her day, some of the tension eased. After Emily went to bed, Rachel and I lingered in the kitchen, cleaning up. "Thank you for staying," she said softly. I nodded, not sure what to say. "Jason," she began, her voice trembling, "I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I might never get one, but I just want you to know I still love you. And no matter what happens, I'll never stop trying to be better. For you, for Emily, for myself." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the faintest glimmer of possibility. The weeks that followed Rachel's heartfelt confession were some of the most confusing of my life. For every step we took toward normalcy, there were moments that pulled me back into the pain of her betrayal. Trust, I realized, wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, or even in a few months. But there was a part of me that wanted to believe her. Maybe it was for Emily's sake, or maybe it was because I missed the life we used to have. Whatever the reason, I found myself inching closer to the idea of forgiveness, even as the wounds remained fresh. Family therapy sessions with Dr. Mendez had become a routine, and while they were exhausting, they were also oddly therapeutic. Rachel continued to take accountability, never once deflecting blame or making excuses. She talked about how she'd let her insecurities and frustrations fester instead of addressing them, and how her choices had destroyed the foundation of our marriage. "I can't undo what I've done," she said during one session, "but I can learn from it, and I can promise never to let it happen again." Her words felt genuine, but I'd heard promises before. One evening, after Emily had fallen asleep at my apartment, I sat down with a notebook and began listing everything that had been swirling in my mind. I wrote 2 columns: reasons to stay and reasons to leave. On the stay side, I wrote, "Emily deserves a united family." Rachel seems genuinely remorseful. There were good times before this. On the leave side, I wrote, "Trust is broken. The betrayal is too deep to forget. I don't know if I'll ever feel the same about her." The list stared back at me, unbalanced but equally heavy. No matter how I looked at it, the decision felt impossible. A few days later, Rachel invited me to dinner again. This time, she'd gone out of her way to recreate one of our favorite meals from before everything fell apart: grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and a bottle of wine we used to share on special occasions. "I wanted to remind you," she said softly, as we sat at the table, "of what we had before I ruined it." I didn't respond right away, unsure if I could trust the warmth I felt creeping into my chest. "Rachel," I said finally, "you don't have to keep trying to win me back with grand gestures. What I need is time, consistency, honesty." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I know, and I'm willing to give you as much time as you need. I don't want you to give up on us." One night, I found myself standing in front of a photo album Rachel had left on the living room shelf. I flipped through the pages, tracing the memories of happier times. Our wedding day, Emily's first steps, family vacations filled with laughter. For the first time in months, I didn't feel anger when I looked at those photos. I felt sadness, yes, but also a quiet yearning for what we'd lost. The question I couldn't shake was this: could we ever find our way back to those moments? Or had too much been destroyed to rebuild? The turning point came one afternoon when I picked up Emily from school. As we walked to the car, she slipped her tiny hand into mine and looked up at me. "Daddy," she said, her voice serious, "do you think we'll all live together again someday?" The innocence in her question broke me. I crouched down to her level, brushing a stray curl from her face. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said honestly. "But I promise, no matter what happens, Mommy and I both love you more than anything." She nodded, as if my answer was enough for now. But as I drove home, her words lingered, pressing against the walls of my heart. That evening, I called Rachel. "We need to talk," I said. Her voice wavered. "Okay. When?" "Tomorrow," I said. "I'll come by after work." The next night, I walked into the house we'd once shared, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. Rachel was waiting in the living room, looking nervous but composed. "Jason," she began, standing as I entered. "Before you say anything, I just want to thank you for giving me the chance to show you I'm serious about fixing this. You know that motioning for her to seat. I've thought about this a lot," I said, my voice steady. "About us. About whether I can forgive you. Whether I want to." Her face paled, but she didn't interrupt. "The truth is, I don't know if things will ever go back to the way they were," I continued. "But I do know that I'm tired of living in anger. And I'm tired of keeping Emily in this limbo." A single tear slipped down her cheek. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying I'm willing to try," I said, the words feeling both heavy and freeing. "I'm not promising things will work out. I'm not even promising I'll ever fully trust you again. But I'm willing to take the first step. For Emily. For us." Rachel broke down, her sobs shaking her shoulders as she nodded. "Thank you," she said through her tears. "Thank you for giving me a chance. I won't waste it, Jason. I swear." That night, as I drove back to my apartment, I felt a strange mix of fear and hope. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't facing it alone. Trying again was a leap of faith, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. Rachel and I had decided to start slowly, weekly dinners as a family, more open communication, and most importantly, transparency. For her, it meant no more secrets. For me, it meant letting my guard down enough to believe that change was possible. The first dinner was awkward. Emily, of course, was thrilled to have both of us sitting at the table again, her excitement filling the silences Rachel and I struggled to bridge. When Emily ran off to play after dessert, Rachel and I lingered in the kitchen. "I know this is hard for you," she said softly, rinsing dishes at the sink. "It's hard for me too, but I'm glad you're here." I nodded, unsure how to respond. The truth was I was glad too, though the weight of our history made it hard to admit. We kept things simple at first, sticking to neutral ground. Therapy sessions with Dr. Mendez shifted from purely co-parenting to exploring our marriage and what had led us to this point. "You both need to be honest, not just with each other, but with yourselves," Dr. Mendez said during one session. "What do you want? What are you afraid of? And what will it take to rebuild trust?" Rachel opened up more than I expected, talking about the loneliness and resentment she'd felt when I threw myself into work. "I'm not excusing what I did," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I destroyed your trust, and I hate myself for it. But I also felt invisible, Jason, like I didn't matter anymore." Her words stung, but they forced me to confront my own shortcomings. I had been distant. I'd buried myself in the business, assuming Rachel would always be there. That didn't excuse her betrayal, but it did explain how we'd drifted apart. "I should have noticed," I admitted. "I should have been more present." It wasn't easy to say, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Outside of therapy, we continued to take small steps toward normalcy. Rachel started inviting me to join her and Emily on their outings, trips to the zoo, movie nights at home, even a weekend picnic at the park. At first, it felt strange, like playing a role in someone else's life. But gradually, I found myself enjoying the moments, especially when Emily was around. Her laughter was infectious, and for a few hours, it was easy to forget the pain and focus on the joy of being together as a family. One evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Rachel asked if I'd stay for a while. We sat on the couch, the same spot where we'd had so many arguments months ago. "I know this might sound strange," she began, "but I've been journaling again. It's helped me process everything. The pain I've caused, the changes I'm trying to make. I thought, maybe you'd like to read some of it." She handed me a small notebook, her hands trembling slightly. I hesitated before taking it, flipping through the pages. Her words were raw and vulnerable, filled with guilt and reflection. "I know I may never earn Jason's forgiveness, but I'll keep trying because he's worth it. Because Emily deserves parents who can work together, even if love feels impossible right now. I don't want to be the person I was when I hurt him. I want to be better. For him, for Emily, and for myself." I closed the notebook, my chest tightening. "Rachel," I said, my voice quiet, "I see that you're trying, and I want you to know I'm trying too. But this It's going to take time. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. I understand, and I'm not going anywhere. In the following weeks, Rachel made good on her promise to be transparent. She shared details about her day, her therapy sessions, and even the little struggles she faced in learning to forgive herself. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching Emily play in the yard, she turned to me. I've been thinking about what you said about time, she said, and I want you to know that I'm not rushing this. I'm grateful that you're giving us a chance, no matter how long it takes. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real. The real test came when Rachel suggested we take a short trip as a family, a weekend at a cabin by the lake. It doesn't have to mean anything, she said quickly. I just thought it might be nice for Emily. And for us. I hesitated but eventually agreed. The cabin was a place we'd visited before, during happier times, and I wasn't sure how it would feel to return. To my surprise, the trip went better than I expected. We spent the days fishing, hiking, and roasting marshmallows by the fire. Emily was ecstatic, and even Rachel and I found moments of connection, laughing over old memories, sharing quiet conversations after Emily went to bed. One night, as we sat by the fire, Rachel looked over at me. Do you think we'll ever get back to the way things were? I stared into the flames, thinking about her question. No, I said finally. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can build something new. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't just sad. There was hope in them. The trip to the lake cabin marked a turning point for Rachel and me. It wasn't a miraculous fix. We didn't return home suddenly whole, as if the betrayal had never happened. But it was the first time in months that I'd felt hopeful. Back at home, we continued our cautious efforts to rebuild. Rachel remained consistent in her actions, attending therapy, sharing her thoughts openly, and showing me every day that she was committed to repairing what she'd broken. For the first time, I started to believe her. One evening, while Rachel and I were cleaning up after dinner, Emily ran into the kitchen holding her tablet. "Daddy, Mommy," she said excitedly. "Look what I made." She held up the screen, showing a digital drawing of the three of us holding hands, standing in front of a house with a bright yellow sun above it. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Rachel said, kneeling to give her a hug. "Does this mean we're a family again?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with hope. Rachel froze, glancing at me. I crouched down next to Emily, choosing my words carefully. "We'll always be a family," I said. "No matter what. Mommy and I love you so much, and that will never change." She seemed satisfied with that, skipping back to the living room. But Rachel and I both felt the weight of her question. Dr. Mendez encouraged us to start addressing the future more directly in therapy. "You've made progress," she said, "but at some point, you'll need to decide what you want moving forward. Are you building toward reconciliation, or are you simply co-parenting more effectively?" The question lingered between us, heavy and unavoidable. As the weeks passed, I found myself drawn to the idea of reconciliation, though it terrified me. Trust was still a fragile thing between us, and I wasn't sure if I could ever fully let go of the past. But Rachel's consistency was undeniable. She didn't just say the right things. She followed through with action. She kept her phone unlocked and accessible, something she'd done voluntarily since the beginning of our separation. She took full responsibility for her mistakes without deflecting blame, and she never once pushed me to forgive her before I was ready. But what struck me most was her patience with herself. She wasn't just focused on fixing our relationship. She was focused on becoming a better version of herself. One night, after Emily was asleep, Rachel and I sat on the couch watching a movie. Halfway through, she muted the TV and turned to me. "Jason," she said hesitantly, "do you ever think about us? About where this is going?" I looked at her, taking a deep breath. "I think about it all the time," I admitted. "And," she asked, her voice trembling, I want to try," I said finally. "But it has to be a fresh start. We can't just go back to the way things were. We have to build something new, together." Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "I want that too," she whispered. Reconciliation wasn't a straight path. There were setbacks, moments when old wounds reopened, when anger and doubt crept back in. But each time, we chose to confront those feelings together instead of letting them fester. Rachel continued her therapy, and I continued mine. We also began attending couples counseling outside of our sessions with Dr. Mendez. It wasn't easy, but it gave us tools to communicate more effectively and address the lingering pain head-on. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Rachel reached for my hand. "I know I've said this before," she said softly, "but I'll never stop being sorry for what I did. And I'll never stop trying to make it right." I squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of her words. "And I'll never stop trying to move forward," I said. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the same team again. It wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be. But it was real. 6 months after that conversation on the porch, I stood in the backyard watching Emily play with a kite. Her laughter echoed through the crisp autumn air, and for a moment, everything felt okay. Not perfect, not like a fairy tale, but okay. Rachel stepped out of the house, carrying a tray with 2 mugs of tea. She handed me one, her fingers brushing mine. "She's so happy," she said, nodding toward Emily. "She deserves to be," I replied, taking a sip. Rachel glanced at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "Do you think we're finally getting there?" I took a deep breath, considering her question. "I think we're on our way," I said. Looking back on everything that had happened, the lies, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it was hard to believe how far we'd come. Rebuilding a marriage after such a deep wound wasn't something I'd ever imagined myself doing. There were days I wanted to give up, to walk away and never look back. But there were also moments like this one when I was glad I stayed. Rachel and I were still a work in progress. We probably always would be. Trust, I'd learned, wasn't something you could rebuild with grand gestures or quick fixes. It was a slow, deliberate process, built one moment, one choice at a time. One of the most important lessons I'd learned was the power of forgiveness. Not just for Rachel, but for myself. Holding on to anger had felt safe for a while, but it had also kept me stuck. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or excusing what had happened. It meant letting go of the pain so it couldn't control me anymore. Emily was a big part of why I chose to fight for our marriage, but over time, I realized I wasn't just doing it for her. I was doing it for me too. Rachel and I had built a life together, a messy, complicated, imperfect life, but it was ours. And while we couldn't erase the past, we could choose what came next. The day Tim was sentenced was a strange one. He'd taken a plea deal, admitting to the embezzlement and agreeing to restitution. Seeing his name in the headlines brought back a wave of anger and resentment, but it was also a reminder of how far I'd come. He hadn't just stolen from my business. He'd almost destroyed my family. But almost wasn't the same as did. One evening, as we tucked Emily into bed, she looked up at us with a sleepy smile. "I love you, Mommy and Daddy," she said, snuggling into her blankets. Rachel and I exchanged a glance, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Rachel and I weren't the same people we'd been before everything fell apart. We'd both grown, both changed, and in a strange way, the struggles we'd faced had made us stronger. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew we were committed to facing it together. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real, and sometimes that was enough. Final reflection. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that love isn't just about the good times. It's about what you do when everything falls apart. It's about fighting for what matters, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. If you're in a place where you feel lost, where you don't know how to move forward, my advice is this: take it one step at a time. Whether you choose to forgive, to rebuild, or to walk away, do what feels right for you. For me, the choice to stay was the hardest one I've ever made, but it was also the bravest. And that's where I'll leave it. Thanks for reading. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and see you soon.